Japan had been losing for over a year before the bombs fell. By early 1945, its navy was effectively gone. Its air force was running out of trained pilots to replace the ones lost. American B-29s were firebombing Japanese cities with almost no resistance. Tokyo burned in March 1945. One night, roughly 100,000 civilians dead, and yet Japan did not surrender. That gap, between obvious military collapse and actual surrender, is where this story lives. Understanding it requires looking past the bombs themselves. It requires understanding what Japan's leadership actually feared and why. In 1945, Japan was not governed by one clear authority. Power sat inside a complex structure: the military, the cabinet, the emperor's advisors. The Supreme War Council, called the Big Six, held most of the real weight. 3 of those 6 were hardcore military men who refused to consider surrender. They were not stupid or suicidal men in the simple sense. They believed, with some logic, that Japan still held leverage. Millions of troops remained stationed in China and throughout Southeast Asia. The home islands still had an army, roughly 2 to 3 million soldiers, and they were preparing for what they called Ketsu-Go, the decisive final battle. The idea was to bleed an American invasion so severely that Washington would negotiate. Not unconditional surrender, a negotiated peace, one that preserved the emperor's throne. That single condition, the emperor, was the axis everything else turned on. Hirohito was not just a political figure to most Japanese people. He was considered divine, literally descended from the sun goddess in state ideology. Surrendering without a guarantee for his position felt, to the military leaders, unacceptable. It would mean the potential trial, humiliation, or removal of a living god. In the summer of 1945, Japan began quietly reaching out through neutral channels. Soviet diplomats in Moscow received Japanese inquiries about possible mediation. The Japanese ambassador there, Naotake Sato, sent cables back to Tokyo throughout July. Those cables, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, told a complicated story. Sato himself believed Japan should surrender. His cables said so plainly. But the foreign minister in Tokyo, Shigenori Togo, kept stalling, waiting for Soviet help. The Soviets, meanwhile, had already secretly agreed at Yalta to enter the Pacific War. Stalin was waiting for the right moment, not to mediate, but to attack. Japan's diplomatic effort in Moscow was, in hindsight, aimed at the wrong door entirely. Then came Potsdam. In late July 1945, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. It warned of prompt and utter destruction. It did not mention the atomic bomb specifically, that remained classified. It also said nothing clear about the emperor's fate. That omission was deliberate on the American side, but devastating in effect. Japan's Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, under pressure from military hardliners, publicly dismissed it. He used the word Mokusatsu, a word meaning roughly to ignore or treat with contempt. Whether that was his actual intent or a mistranslation, historians still debate. What is not debated is how Washington read it. They read it as rejection. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island. It carried 1 bomb. The bomb had a name, Little Boy. It was a uranium device. It had never been tested in this form. The designers were confident enough that no test was considered necessary. At 8:15 in the morning, Hiroshima time, it detonated roughly 600 meters above the city. The yield was equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT. In the seconds that followed, the center of Hiroshima ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Estimates of the immediate dead range from 70,000 to 80,000 people. By the end of the year, with radiation deaths included, the toll likely exceeded 140,000. The city had been chosen partly because it had not yet been heavily firebombed. That was intentional. The Americans wanted a clean measurement of the bomb's effect. Hiroshima was also a military headquarters city, which provided strategic justification. But its population was overwhelmingly civilian. That fact was known and accepted. Back in Tokyo, the news arrived slowly and in fragments. Initial military reports couldn't explain what had happened. 1 city, 1 plane, 1 bomb. The scale didn't fit any existing category of weapon. It took hours before Tokyo understood that Hiroshima had been largely destroyed. Even then, the Supreme War Council did not immediately convene to discuss surrender. The military faction pushed for more information. They wanted confirmation, not panic. Some within the army quietly suggested the Americans might only have 1 such bomb. 3 days passed. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. This was, for many in the Japanese leadership, the more devastating blow. The Soviet entry destroyed the last diplomatic hope, the back channel through Moscow. It also meant a second front. Soviet forces poured into Manchuria within hours. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most feared, was overwhelmed almost immediately. The speed of the Soviet advance shocked even those who had expected the declaration. Then, on August 9th, the second bomb fell. Nagasaki. A plutonium device this time, the same design tested at Trinity in New Mexico. The original target that day was Kokura. Cloud cover saved it. Nagasaki was the secondary target. The bomb killed an estimated 40,000 people immediately. The final death toll there, as in Hiroshima, climbed significantly in the weeks that followed. After 2 atomic bombs and a Soviet invasion, the Big Six still could not agree. 3 members wanted to continue fighting. 3 wanted to seek peace with conditions. A tied vote in the Supreme War Council was essentially a vote for continued war. What happened next was genuinely unusual in Japanese political history. Prime Minister Suzuki took the deadlock directly to the emperor. Hirohito was asked to break the tie, something the emperor rarely did openly. He did not hesitate. Hirohito said Japan must accept the Potsdam terms and end the war. His stated reason, in the meeting records, centered on the suffering of his people. He also referenced the new weapon. He called it something that altered the balance entirely. Whether his decision was driven by the bombs, the Soviet invasion, or both, is still debated. Most historians now argue the Soviet entry weighed at least as heavily as the atomic bombs. Japan had calculated it could survive American pressure alone. The Soviets changed that math. The surrender decision was made on the night of August 9th into the 10th, but even then the process was not clean. A faction within the Japanese army refused to accept what was happening. Junior officers began plotting to prevent the surrender announcement from reaching the public. They believed the emperor had been manipulated by peace advocates around him. On the night of August 14th, a group of officers stormed the imperial palace grounds. Their goal was to find and destroy the recording Hirohito had made for broadcast. The emperor had recorded his surrender announcement on a phonograph disc. The officers searched through the night. They did not find it. The disc had been hidden. Accounts differ on exactly where by loyal palace staff. By morning, the coup attempt had collapsed. Its leaders took their own lives. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time. Most had never heard him speak. The voice was formal, archaic, difficult to follow. The recording announced that Japan would bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. He did not use the word surrender. The language was deliberately indirect, but the meaning was clear enough. People knelt in the streets. Some wept. Some sat in silence. Soldiers in the field across China and the Pacific received the news with disbelief. Some units did not stand down for days. A few held out far longer than that. Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer in the Philippines, kept fighting until 1974. He was not a myth. He was simply never officially relieved of his orders until then. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. Douglas MacArthur oversaw the ceremony. It lasted less than 30 minutes. Japan's representatives signed first, in silence, under heavy international scrutiny. The war in the Pacific was over. What followed was occupation, reconstruction, and reckoning. Now, the misconception worth addressing directly. The standard Western narrative says the atomic bombs ended the war, full stop. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. Japan's leadership had been split for months. The bombs did not create that split. They intensified a debate that was already happening inside a locked room. The Soviet declaration of war on August 8th removed Japan's last strategic alternative. Without a Soviet mediator, there was no remaining path to a negotiated peace. Both factors, the bombs and the Soviet entry, hit within 3 days of each other. Separating their effects cleanly is something historians have argued over for decades. American records, Japanese cabinet documents, and post-war testimony all tell slightly different stories. What is clear is that no single cause explains the surrender on its own. The bombs were real, and their destruction was real, and their role was real. So was the Soviet invasion. So was the internal collapse of Japan's strategic options. So was the emperor's personal decision to break a deadlock his own council could not resolve. History rarely has one cause. This case is a good example of why. The people who lived through those 10 days in August experienced all of it simultaneously, not as a debate, not as a historical puzzle, as noise, fear, ash, and waiting. One city destroyed on a Monday, another on a Thursday, a Soviet invasion the same week, a coup attempt in the palace, a voice on the radio, silence in the streets. The sequence matters because the decision happened inside that sequence, not before it, not after. And Hirohito's recorded voice, hidden through the night from officers who wanted the war to continue, found its way to the Japanese people the following morning, and the war ended. As with most history of this period, some details remain contested, some documents remain classified, and the motivations of individuals at the center of those decisions are still being argued over. What the record does show is that the ending of the Pacific War was messier, more conditional, and more contested from the inside than most accounts suggest.